Nostalgia is a potent feeling, and it can be bittersweet. Some folks have a very dark childhood, but like to think back to the good times. Personally, when I look back at some media, I get a weird feeling. There's always some sort of dark undertone. You want to look back and taste something much sweeter than reality. At least, that can be the case if things happened when you were younger that you just can't remember. Or that you don't want to remember. Nostalgia can be twisted even for people who don't have those darker undertones, however. Adulthood can twist things and muddy the more laid-back times of being kids. By the time you grow into who you are, you realize the world can be a bitter, terrible place. There is no solution to everything, and most people are as lost as we are. Not a great feeling. That's why there is a lot to be said for the horrors of nostalgia, something I would like to explore in our video today. This is a video essay and opinion piece exploring where nostalgia can be used as a tool for horror well, and where it falls flat. I want to emphasize the opinion part of this piece. I will be exploring things I think just do not work when it comes to twisting nostalgia or using it for horror. Now, some of the pieces I bring up have horror elements, but are actually meant to be comedy. The thing is, I do not find them funny either, and I want to get into why. I want to discuss why some nostalgia pieces, and the twisting of them, work for that off feeling far better than others, and why the horror or comedy of the comparisons just do not work. Otherwise, I want to answer a question. What elements of horror can twist nostalgia into an off feeling, as opposed to comfort? One of my favorite examples of twisted nostalgia is false children's media. Things that seem like they're for kids, but most certainly are not. There are correct ways to go about this, in my opinion, versus ways that just come across as edgy for the sake of being edgy. A piece of horror art that I simply adore and does it right would have to be Don't Hug Me, I'm Scared. Now, there are all sorts of videos digging into what could possibly be the meaning, but I want to focus on the nostalgia factor in particular. Here we have puppets and bright colors at the beginning of each piece to ease the viewer into thinking that, hey, this may be for children. That is, until things for the episode get weird. For example, in the first episode, we're treated with distorted music and pieces of flesh being served to our main characters. Pretty much every episode ends this way, and you never know what you're going to get. For the purpose of this video, even if there are very many interpretations of this piece, Don't Hug Me, I'm Scared feels like the horrors of growing up. Wanting to learn everything in a saturated, sanitary environment that is happy and without horrors. Only to grow up and learn that life isn't that colorful and simple, of course. It sounds like a depressing interpretation, but I think the idea of keeping that hint of childhood wonder is also important. No matter what happens, after all, the puppets continue to want to keep learning. Or at least, they do when they get to Season 2. Season 1's ending just descended into terrifying madness for poor Yellow Guy, who was being tormented by the time he got to Dreams. They really were trying to put effort into learning everything and asking questions, only to have that shattered by the teacher's cruelty every single time. I guess. Therefore, a better way to look at that is to be open-minded, but also very cautious. Either way, Don't Hug Me, I'm Scared touches that children's show angle of nostalgia well, and twists it with the horror elements at the end, which to me are very well done, and build a good story with so many ways to interpret it. Another thing I wanted to mention in this section, which is another golden example of intentionally twisted children's media, are fake lost footage in analog horror. For those who have not heard of analog horror, it is an internet horror genre that utilizes old media like what you would find on informational VCRs or old 1970s to 1990s television channels. Sometimes, farther back. Back when young people actually watched the news on TV, because, we don't anymore. The analog horror that comes to mind from morphing children's media is Local 58's Show for Children. It has classic animation with a little skeleton character that keeps peeking into graves, sees creepy stuff, and is dead in the end. Just a skeleton. That cartoon gets progressively more creepy, and I love it. It has that hit of nostalgia with it being an old cartoon, and a proper build-up to the creep factor, which, mercifully, is not gore for the sake of shock. The moon peering into the grave slowly is far more creepy than the realistic skeleton, as it's the antagonist of that analog horror. Another very similar, with a different plot, analog horror, is Gemini Home Entertainment's videos. There are various seemingly children-targeted old VCR-like videos that talk about animals and solar systems, which seem normal, until the music cuts out, and the wood crawlers or evil planets are spotlighted. The normalcy shifting to eerie is key in that case, which Local 58 does well too. Now, the main portion of that analog horror I wanted to talk about today, though, is Game for Kids. It seems normal at the beginning, though I would argue it starts off as eerie because the atmosphere feels off to me. Granted, I did not grow up in a house that looks remotely like that, so the unfamiliarity may have a factor here. Despite this, I recognize it as some sort of fun and short instructional film I would have seen as a child. The use of music and its stopping when the true horror seeps into the video is very effective for the eerie feeling. No jump scares are needed, as the atmosphere does a total shift. The sense of familiarity is still there, set up in the beginning of the video, but it slowly drains into true horror as you realize something is very wrong. The sense of normality that slowly shifts into uncanny territory is a very effective tool in helping the horror of nostalgia shine through. It does not need to be in your face and off right away to get the message across. The key to properly blending horror into kids' media to truly send shivers down an adult's spine, in my opinion, is being subtle rather than in your face. Nursery rhymes can be creepy due to the familiarity and, at times, twisted meaning. Just like with fairy tales, which are darker under the surface than they may seem, nursery rhymes can be quite creepy. That said, that isn't the case for all of them, but any nursery rhyme sung in a certain way can be made creepy. That can be the case for any song, granted, just like into Chase Hulfinder's high to low key music. In my video, The Uncanny Valley of Sound, I sang Ring Around the Rosie and slowed it down to be far creepier. That was intentionally trying to be creepy, but in normal cases, nursery rhymes are meant to be a comfort for kids. I remember when I was a child, my father would sing Rockabye Baby to me. It was comforting, so that song would be nostalgic. However, when you look into the lyrics of that nursery rhyme, you realize how dark it really is. It is all about a cradle, holding a baby, falling from a tree when the branch breaks. You can likely guess the fate of the baby from there. The familiarity of these rhymes to many people is the nostalgia factor, and the realization that they can have much darker meanings is the creep factor, which is done really well. Again, this is quite subtle, and you would need to look into it or think a bit more deeply regarding these rhymes to really cut deep into the horror aspect. I feel like, therefore, singing them in a creepy way is much more effective. Some songs sound creepy and really are meant to have a brighter meaning. What comes to mind there is Tiny Tim's Tiptoe Through the Tulips. Some people find it really creepy. Personally, it is not creepy at all to me, and just quite sweet. The context adds to that. It's just meant to be a happy song. Yet, many do find it creepy, so I wanted to bring it up. In this instance, one part of the creep factor is satisfied. It sounds scary to some, but the context does not make it scary. Another layer which makes the creep factor work better, and of course blends nostalgia in because of some of the rhymes you may recognize from childhood, or at least have supposed childhood whimsy, would be rhymes that do have a completely dark meaning and are sang in a creepy way. Put two and two together, and you have a potent mixture. Here are some examples. Jack and Jill. Jack and Jill went up the hill to fetch a pail of water. Jack fell down and broke his crown, and Jill came tumbling after. There are a few versions of that rhyme, and theories about its origin. None of it has been confirmed, hence the word theory, but one of the darker ones relates to the execution of the ministers of a former king when a new one took the throne. Also, that isn't the full rhyme. Another version has Jack and Jill return home, or Jack treating his wound with vinegar. Much less dark. It depends on the origin of the rhyme for context, but darker theories can make a rhyme creepier, because they could very well be the true origin. Or it could just be folks throughout history trying to be edgy, but either way, hopefully you get my point. Thinking about it, given there is another verse to the rhyme that isn't included most of the time, this particular rhyme comes across as far more creepy than it has to be if the theory of its origin is not correct. Therefore, let's talk next about a very straightforward one. It's raining, it's pouring, the old man is snoring. He bumped his head on the top of the bed and couldn't get up in the morning. We don't really need the origin, which is quite recent to be honest, or theories on it to understand the song is actually quite morbid. I mean, the old man dies in the end. Someone could argue he just had a headache and didn't get up, which is cute, but I think we all know what really happened, especially if the rhyme is sung in an eerie manner. All that said, in the end, nursery rhymes and their nostalgia are what you make of them. Even if you've never heard of a particular nursery rhyme before, the fact that it could be associated with childhood and have a certain tone may be a bit off-putting. That's the relevance and beauty of the horror of nostalgia. The theories of origin in the lyrics themselves may add to it, and there would be varying degrees a nursery rhyme could be made creepy. It's why they work so well in a horror medium with implied ghost children. I would like to compare the media I mentioned in the good section to something like Happy Tree Friends. You get a starkly different feel. As a full disclaimer, I am not a fan of Happy Tree Friends. I may have been intrigued as a teenager, but it was a phase I grew out of. Looking back, and at Happy Tree Friends in general, I cannot help but roll my eyes. Again, this is a personal opinion, but to me, this is the definition of edgy for the sake of being edgy. This is a case of it being used for comedy, sort of, but the gore element shifts Happy Tree Friends into horror as well. It also is really not funny, even if it's meant to be comedy. Let me explain why I think this. Let's go back to the good I spoke about with Don't Hug Me, I'm Scared. While Don't Hug Me, I'm Scared has a lot of mixed horror elements, aside from just gore and character torture, with a lot to dissect, Happy Tree Friends' whole premise is to torture cute characters for the lols. I doubt anyone can tell me the point of that show aside from let's watch a bunch of cartoon animals get horribly gored. One could argue the same for old slapstick cartoons like Tom and Jerry, but there's a point at which the slapstick gets far too excessive, and Happy Tree Friends crosses that line. After all, Tom and Jerry has little to no gore, from what I remember. and I'm someone who's fine with and likes talking about gore, so long as it isn't in stupid excess, like Happy Tree Friends. Whereas Happy Tree Friends goes right into edgy territory for the sake of shock value, Don't Hug Me, I'm Scared has so many different interpretations, and a real sense of offness that I really enjoy. It feels like a true nightmare as opposed to something pointlessly ridiculous. Gore can work if it's mixed in with multiple different horror elements and pulled off at the right time. The contrast of it being in a puppet kid show just feels a lot more eerie with all of the other story beats. You never know what to expect when watching Don't Hug Me, I'm Scared. There's a sense of nostalgic comfort from it being a learning show, but that slowly drains away as the episode carries on. None of that subtle offness is present in Happy Tree Friends to me. Don't Hug Me, I'm Scared takes that victory with ease. I also wanted to quickly mention violent Pokemon parodies. While they technically are not horror, they miss the mark like Happy Tree Friends. In my opinion, it's a miss for parody as well. I simply do not find it funny. Due to the gore in some of them, one could argue they fall into horror just a touch. A short mention is enough to get my point across, however, in this case. And don't get me wrong, Pokemon can be violent and gory, but it would be better in a serious setting as opposed to some silly parody. Speaking of ridiculous parodies that miss the mark. Most fairy tales actually are much darker than how they are presented in things like Disney. Writing them in their original morbid fashion or retelling them in a much creepier way is a great way to use nostalgia as a tool for horror. However, sometimes when stories enter the public domain, things happen. Things like Winnie the Pooh, Blood and Honey. If this were a movie review channel, I would watch it and rip it to shreds. As a full disclaimer, I have not seen this movie, but word by mouth and reviews say a lot. Plus, I really do find the premise really stupid. This is an example, in my opinion, of nostalgia and horror mixing horribly. It frustrates me because twisting fairy tales or stories can be turned into something truly terrifying with actual effort. One weird example of this is the eldritch nightmare the internet made Garfield. There are a lot of terrifying concepts done well with that. Taking a beloved story and twisting it would work better if it was not a slasher. Low-budget slashers are not a thing I am a fan of to begin with, due to the bad story and effort. Again, this is just for me. If you enjoy it, then power to you. However, I do wish the idea of twisting that story into horror could be taken a bit more seriously. There are numerous ways to make Pooh actually scary, such as possessed dolls, the corrupted Wonderland concept, cursed toys, and more. The possessed dolls concept would be similar to the Five Nights at Freddy's lore, but with dolls. For those who do not know, corpses of children were shoved into animatronics, causing them to be possessed and very aggressive. Also, Chucky works for this case too. Corrupted Wonderland is basically another world that was once bright and kind, turning very morbid and dangerous. The idea of cursed toys can be taken many directions in general. My point is, there are plenty of solid ideas that could be done well, but falling back on making a low-grade slasher when movies enter public domain is pretty frustrating. I believe both the slasher and other stories can exist simultaneously, but the problem is people take the other ideas less seriously when the slasher turns people away from the idea. A concept I am very familiar with, considering a large segment of my channel at one point was dedicated to covering the backrooms. While that is very fun internet horror lore in general, my thought here would be related to the spaces themselves, not the lore. I am not doing a full dedicated section on this because it has been covered in many other videos, though I'm interested in exploring the concept more if people are interested. I don't know how much new things I can say, but there is that haunted sense of nostalgia in some liminal spaces for many folks, which is very intriguing. These weren't really meant to be nostalgic in nature, more like people knew about them as children and probably got into this horror then. That leads to the nostalgia factor, even if a lot of them are not considered great. The story portion would land them in dishonorable mentions, but would really not count for the horror of nostalgia, as nostalgia isn't a huge factor in the first place. Well, for most of them. I suppose retro video game creepypasta would count. Really though, the nostalgia of seeing these stories themselves is what I'd want to mention. Or rather, the pictures. Lost media for things like the Jeff the Killer photo have people intrigued, and the nostalgia factor and horror surrounding it is the mystery of the origin. I wanted to mention the unintentional nostalgic horror here for obvious reasons. There's a really strange in-between of good and bad, which leads to good, mostly. We are finally coming to a close. I wanted to end this with something in between good and bad, like a train wreck. Something I sincerely cannot look away from, but do not necessarily like. I also don't think I hate it. It's really hard to explain, which is why, in the end, I believe it is very well done. I'm talking about Meat Canyon. The animation style is grotesque intentionally, but it is also done very well. The premise of Meat's channel, aside from his original animations, is parodies of cartoons, brands, or other well-known entities, most of which would be from our childhood. In my opinion, this content is top tier, even though sometimes I feel as though both my brain and eyes are bleeding. It causes an uncomfortable, visceral reaction, which is exactly what it's going for. Maybe I'm being unfair with calling it the really weird in-between, because there is nothing that should change about it. I just hate how I seem to need to watch every single one, like it's a car crash that I cannot look away from. That is more of a statement on me than the content, or perhaps a positive statement on the content. It is the correct way to mix nostalgia, parody, and horror. While one may argue it could feel edgy because of the heavy shock value, the delivery is so well done with the high-tier animation style and, most importantly, never knowing what exactly you will get when watching a Meat Canyon video. Good on them for making most of their viewers feel super odd and uncomfortable when watching. Horror invoking that reaction is quite well done. Exploring the right and wrong ways, in my opinion, of using nostalgia and horror was a lot of fun, and it inspired a few ideas. I want to look into nursery rhymes more in the future. That, and the subject of a couple of nursery rhymes, Bloody Mary, something nostalgic to me given I did that ritual as a kid. Supposedly, I saw someone behind me in the mirror, but you know how kids are. Anyway, to use nostalgia effectively, I like to see things being subtle, except for in the case of Meat Canyon, who is not subtle, but rather incredibly unexpected. There are ways to adapt things you may have seen from your childhood to be used in an effective, horrific way. Something not effective, in my opinion, is the gore and shock value of Happy Tree Friends or slashers based off of public domain stories. They just don't hit, and are neither scary nor funny to me. All of that said, I hope you enjoyed this little journey through my opinions here. If you disagree with anything I said, that is entirely fair. Please explain your thoughts in the comments. Same for if you agree with me here and why, or if you have other ideas that I hadn't mentioned. That said, Have a nice night or day, wherever it is for you folks.